think we've all had that fantasy before. You know, where you take all your stuff and you throw it in a suitcase and you just hit the road looking for a life of adventure. Now, for most of us, that idea kind of gets tossed out the window as we grow older and we're searching for some stability in our lives. But there's a certain type of person who actually chases that dream, makes it happen. The type of person who just jumps in the deep end and hopes for the best along the way. Niko Leo is one of those people. For 8 years, Niko worked as a full-time street performer, known at the time as Magician on a Motorcycle, and he traveled the globe, bringing his unique performance to audiences of all types. I first met Niko at Seattle's Folklife Festival, where he was performing his magic show for a big crowd, and I personally love magic. It's something I'm definitely going to be talking about more on this channel. So when he was finished with the show, I stopped and introduced myself to him. We kind of hit it off, and over the next few years, whenever he was in town, I'd stop and see his show, and I'd ask him questions about the experience. He'd tell me cool stories and insights, things like how to grow a crowd or how to get better tips. So not only did we develop kind of a cool friendship, but he was also this interesting look into the world of street theater. So when the pandemic hit in 2020, I couldn't help but think about Niko and the street performing community in general. The skills that they'd been developing for years and years were suddenly no longer a viable way of making a living, as people were staying inside and avoiding forming crowds at all costs. As it turned out, Niko had actually returned to Seattle and was focusing on pivoting his career. So I thought it'd be interesting to sit down with him and have a conversation about the big transition. Niko, thank you for being the first person to come for an in-person interview.
I'm honored. I'm honored.
This might be a little rough as I try to figure out how to fit this role.
That's what it's for.
But I'm looking forward to it. So, Niko Leo, is that the preferred name for me to go
yes. Yeah, I have been in many forms, but at this point, Niko Leo is the stable one.
Cool. So, for years and years and years, as long as I've known you, you were traveling as a street performer known as the Magician on a Motorcycle, traveling from Seattle to New Orleans to other various destinations and entertaining people all along the way. Could you start by just telling me how that got started?
Well, getting into magic began as a social expansion endeavor. I was painfully shy as a kid, and then when high school passed and I was no longer a sports star, I was in college and shy again, and so magic helped break out of that. And then I wanted to travel, and I had been in New Orleans before, visiting my father and seeing that there were street performers down there. So I knew that it existed in a example. So after getting out of school in Washington, I went down on a little 3-month trip. I gave myself 3 months to come back, either having lost money or not. And it worked well enough to continue it when I came back to Washington. Started working Pike Place, doing little small sidewalk shows for 5-10 people at a time. And by the end of the summer, I had saved up enough for a motorcycle, 2004. With like 4,000 miles on it, and it now has, I've put a little over 50,000 miles on it since then.
So how long were you practicing magic before you started like turning it into a job?
I had been paid for it maybe 3 or 4 times. It was just like random one-off gigs that were for probably far less than I should have charged. But it was the thing where I was just surprised somebody was going to pay me for it.
Yeah.
So I had probably been doing it for 2 or 3 years. Probably by the time I set off on that adventure, it was about 3.5 years.
So what was it like taking that leap? Like actually because I practice magic as a hobby too. I did a little bit of it, like paid gigs here and there, but it was so infrequent that the idea of like dedicating, you're just jumping into it like that is very intimidating. So tell me about like coming to that decision where you made the leap, so to speak.
I did have a little crossover. I did have some crossover. I was doing some other work for that first little bit in that 3 month trip down to New Orleans to figure it out the first time. I was doing some construction, and by about halfway through that, about 2 months into it, I was starting to make more in a day doing magic than I was doing a day of construction. Um, but I enjoyed it so much more. And then in Seattle, I was working at a hookah bar at night and then doing street shows during the day. So there was like a 5 or 6 month period where I could transition into it. And the metric for me really was when I started making more doing street than I was doing whatever else I was doing. Um, so going at it in a gradual way, I think helped a lot and gave me a measure, a metric, like a viable metric to compare it to that let me know I would be successful by my own standards if I was doing just that.
Yeah. One of the things that I'd love to hear you talk about a little more is like the difference between doing magic in like a more intimate environment like a hookah bar or like a house party versus out on the street where you don't know the people, you have to actually get them to stop and pay attention to you. Tell me about that transition.
It made a lot more sense to me once someone told me it was a different thing. I was doing a totally different thing. Like the initial idea that I think a lot of people trying street is like, I'm good at blank, I'm good at playing guitar or juggling or whatever, so I should be able to go do it on the street. But it really is like you're learning a completely different thing. And if you don't have a frame that way, then you could find it very frustrating to be like doing an excellent juggling pattern that no one gives a shit about. Because you didn't crowd build, you didn't build the dynamic of an audience and a performer. So that is the biggest difference. Is it's a separate art form. I have seen guys do shows for 500 people with like a hollow tennis racket. And that's it. That's the only thing he has. And he manages to build the crowd because that's the thing that he worked really good at. That he got really good at was how to street perform. The contortion part of it is, mediocre skill development at best. But if you watch various street performances and people that are building and interacting with crowds, there's things in common across that. So when that clicked for me, I began watching every show I could. Anybody that was performing in New Orleans at that time outside, I saw them and annoyingly like sat in the front row with a notebook. So
So you had kind of a mentor in like learning street, right? Jimmy, is that his name? Right?
yeah, he doesn't like to be referred to as mentor to people because like in magic it's a very some people there is a lot of like tradition
But you learned a lot from it.
And as far as a street figure, yes, this guy Jimmy Toxlet was the first of the older crew around that time that spent a little time talking to me about it. So
Did you meet him in New Orleans?
yeah, I met him in New Orleans. He saw me doing with a harmonica rack, doing beatbox harmonica coin manipulations. So like a music magic set on a corner doing basically walk by. So like nobody was stopped. But he saw that I was at least not doing the like cookie cutter street magic show and was trying to do my own thing as an artist. And that I think is what first let me into his world a little bit. And then the thing that really made him, I think, endeared to me was I went and tried Bourbon Street one day, which is a chaos in every capacity as far as trying to entertain and hold people's attention.
Yeah.
And and he was working there, and I kind of went back and forth a few times with him, alternating during spots. And at the end of the day, I was sort of sat on the curb, almost with my head in my hands, and I was like, "This isn't like this can't be what this is about." He could see that the creator in me was very frustrated at the attention, not being able to properly street perform. So that was when he pulled me aside and was like, here's the structure of a show. You need to have people stopped first more than anything. Doesn't matter how you get them stopped. Just get their feet not moving anymore. And I learned a lot of subtleties, how to read crowds, if they have bags in their hands, drinks, the pace they're moving, the makeup, like character makeup, if it's families or whatever.
I find the like whole street culture really interesting. Like there seems to be like an interesting mix of like support with like, you know, if you see another performer, you tend to try to help them out, give them tips, but there also is like a level of competitiveness where like you're fighting for the same spots, you're fighting for the same audience a lot of the time, fighting for the same tips. What's your experience working with other performers in that way?
Sometimes I could tell what kind of day it was. Like if I had something that made it to where I couldn't work the morning as I normally wouldn't get out until like 3 or 4 in the afternoon. I could often tell what kind of day it was just by people's demeanor. And by people, I mean the other performers, the tarot readers and artists and such. Street, at least in the context of New Orleans, where traffic flow varies quite a bit, it's really feast or famine. And on the days where money's flowing, like just everybody out there's in a good mood and are like more than willing to scoot over and give you a little space or make change for you or whatever. But when it is bad, like it is on most people's faces. You can see that they are not hitting their goals for the day, and they're then gonna, you know, it almost doesn't matter how strong of a relationship you have with them, they're just going to be a little less likely to be helpful and friendly in that scenario. Their basic need of the day isn't quite getting met. So with other performers, that can scale into their like personal life, like how well do they have the rest of their life together. That can be a pretty big determiner of how willing they're going to be to share a spot or help out or, you know, be cooperative.
So you started off doing this as a 3-month experiment. How long did you end up doing it? How long did this experiment run?
I was a full-time busker from 2012 to 2020, pretty much March
8 years.
Yeah.
That's pretty crazy.
Yeah, it was a great line in the show. I tell people in 6 years into a 3-month experiment, 7 years, 8 years.
Became a better line every year.
Every year it became better, yeah. I had always told myself that I was going to do a serious check-in at 10 years with street. I had just seen too many guys that were in their late 40s, 50s that were in the same situation I was, but I was like 26 and like needed rent for the day. And I just didn't want to be 56 needing rent for the day.
Yeah.
So the pandemic cut me 2 years short of that, but there's no saying I won't go back out to doing it at some point.
Yeah. I definitely want to get more into how the pandemic kind of forced your hand and sort of changed your life. But before we get into that, I want to hear more about the traveling days. Mm-hmm. So tell me a little bit about like what got you to keep coming back to Seattle? Because from my perspective, I've never been to New Orleans, but from at least an outsider's perspective, it seems like Seattle has much more of a indoor culture, like a kind of closed off, isolated sort of culture. In New Orleans, at least what you see of it, you know, in pop culture and whatnot, seems like it's a very like extroverted place. Like people are outside, people are doing things, which at a first glance seems like it would just work better for street performing. But you kept coming back. Usually in the summers, you'd be back here. So what was sort of the differences between the two places in your experience, and why did you keep going back between the two?
Well, um, being raised in Washington and having the rest of my family still up here and just more of a support system up here, that was part of it. But culturally, the differences were stark. Like, even in that first year or two, I would be walking around my neighborhood in New Orleans and people would be saying hi to me. And it's like, I don't know these people. And as I'm just walking by, they're striking up conversations. And I often, in the first week or two, like, wasn't sure they were talking to me. Because that's just not what happens up here. It's not what happens in Washington. Uh, and it didn't take me long to piece together the climate difference. And like even now, just walking around, it's pouring in Seattle out right now. But like I walked up to the door like this, whereas when you're on your stoop in 80-degree weather, you are like this, like your body is open. And in Washington, 8 months of the year, our bodies tend to be closed. But in those 4 months, when they do open up, that was when I would come back for street and really play the rhythms of people's energy as it matched up and synced up with the environment.
And how is that different in the two places? What's the difference in the energy of the crowd in somewhere like Seattle during the summer versus somewhere like New Orleans?
Seattle in the summer, the people that do live here year round are like the average person in Seattle outside in August.
Fuck is going on out there? Sorry about that.
The average person going outside in August is in Seattle is going to be in a better mood than the average person in August coming out in Kansas or even California. Like the rarity of the nice days make it so the average baseline mood is higher up here. At least that's been my experience. Seattle and North in general, not to be like generalizing, but the fancier jokes, the more intricate wordplay, the more subtleties, and general like intelligence correlated connection and being able to understand the material was higher in the North, and that was always nice. You go to New York or Seattle, and you can like make more complicated jokes, which personally I enjoyed a lot, though I realize it's not necessarily a good thing to have for street. Like you kind of want to play the common denominator, and if you are going high, you want to do it subtle enough to where the people that miss it don't realize they missed a joke. Does that make them feel bad? But in the South, in New Orleans, people are there for fun. Like it's very much a like place where people are there to let loose, which is good for their openness. They're more open and more willing to walk up and try something new. But that is volatile energy, and there are often groups that are too open to have something coordinated, semi-coordinated work.
Yeah. So we've talked a bit about the destinations. What was it like on the trips in between? It seems like it would be lonely.
Yeah, this is part of why I was starting to taper out of street. The long-term effects of being a one-man show and then traveling solo and just generally having a lifestyle that was built around like moving frequently and being able to make spontaneous decisions about where I was headed. The loneliness was always a factor in it, but I feel like the perks that I got out of it were so powerful that it never really became an overbearing thing. It did put a filter on my interactions. So anytime I would meet a girl, I would like, it was, as a 20-year-old, I'm sure, 20 something year old, I'm sure it worked in my favor more than it didn't. But there was very much a like, I am not a good choice. Like, if there's anything serious to be had here, you should know that I'm not a good choice. I'm going to leave in 4 months. So the adventure part of it, though, is the best thing I ever did with my life. I put myself in so many scenarios where I was not sure what to do, and I had to figure it out. And that was the entire point of these trips. I would leave one side of the country with enough money to make it a third of the way, And I needed to look at the map and go like, where are there going to be people that I can then go to this place I've never been and set up and do a show that I am tailoring on the spot to the regional culture. Make enough money to get a hotel room and or just food and gas, and then go out and camp outside of town and keep moving across the map that way. Small bites, and try not to get intimidated by the line, like the length of the line, when you see it going from ocean to ocean.
Yeah. Did you ever have any times that you like crashed the bike or the bike broke down or you were just stranded in the middle of nowhere and didn't like know anyone locally and you were like, what do I do? Like, did that stuff happen?
Yeah, there were a few mechanic things that most of them were just I messed something up and didn't know better. My part of why I chose the bike I have was it's very like sound, very dependable, very easy to work on. So there were only a handful of situations where I was stuck in that regard. I did lay the bike down once trying to outrun a storm in the Midwest, and that was another thing that I just got too cocky. I was making an arrogant mistake, and was fortunate enough to get out with pretty much no damage. The bike slid down a hill, even though there had been trees and like barbed wire fences in different directions. The wind blew me off the road at a point where I could slide down safely, but by the time I got up, it was like I was in a tornado, like in a hurricane.
Wow.
Could barely stand the bike up. It was like a muddy field.
Where were you when that happened?
I was a few hours south of Kansas City, I think. Yeah, that was the most formative experience of that entire time because I reached a point where I did try to get help. I did try to like leave the bike in a field with like lightning striking and the wind knocking me over and like go up to the road and try and get a ride and like bail basically.
Wow.
And like 20 or 30 cars drove past me. I was a motorcyclist on a like, it was kind of a busy highway, but just a 2-lane road, and nobody would stop. And that was a moment where I was like, okay, I am on my own, as the most on my own I can be now. And so I breathed a little bit and went down and triple shot, just thought my way through it. And instead of trying to get the bike up the hill, I took it along the road, like along the hill, where I could then come back around. But that was the scariest and most solidifying experience.
What were your experiences like when you went to Europe to perform? Did you go multiple times?
Yeah. The first time I went,
Did you bring the bike?
No, I had looked into it a handful of times. I've looked at buying bikes over there. I've gotten very close a couple of times. But the first time I went over, I kind of tried to approach it the same way, where I like had enough to make it a third of the way through summer, and I was going to try and make it the rest of summer before I came back.
Mm-hmm. Did you buy a round trip ticket or a one-way ticket?
No,
I don't think
I've ever bought a round trip ticket.
Wow.
Like any of the places I've gone to.
That's cool.
Which I don't know. I haven't. It's worked out so far. But
Yeah.
It's not something I recommend. There's definitely a mental toll that was taken in that, but it helped set goals. It helped me like know I needed to have X amount in order to leave. But the first time I went to Europe, I very much went in without any idea of what I was doing. I landed in Switzerland, and literally like a friend of a friend on Facebook had said I could stay with him an hour or two away from the airport, and I like was at the airport trying to figure out how to get in touch with this guy. And ended up going from place to place, basically just asking where street performers were. Like I set about it as an educational thing where I was going to spend 3 months trying to find every street performer I could. watch as many shows as I could that don't come to the US. And at the end of it was the like mecca of street performance, the Edinburgh Fringe Festival in Scotland. And from the first like week there, first few days there, I knew like, okay, every August from now on, this is where I'll be. And until the pandemic, that was where I was every August from the first time.
How is that festival? How does that festival compare to like Folklife, which is like the local Seattle performer festival? It's the one I'm most familiar with. How would you say the two compare?
Um,
Is it the same kind of thing where there's just like free floating spots and it's kind of like first come gets the spot? Is there a rotation process?
so there is street component to Edinburgh. There's street events, and that's all structured within the confines of where the festival occurs. The city itself like triples in population during this time, and it's already a pretty big city. So there are places to perform outside the festival that are more free for all, but the heart of Edinburgh is indoor shows, is like curated, scheduled performances. People do runs throughout the whole month. So it's a month long festival, so you're doing 28 days of performing. Um, so to compare it to Folklife, it's like if Folklife was also occurring in Capitol Hill and downtown and in Ballard and
I
like
wish.
in several different areas. In Edinburgh, there's hundreds and hundreds of venues.
So when you were performing there, which method did you go with? Were you like working with the festival and had like your spot indoors somewhere, or were you going around the city and finding different spots?
I was pretty much exclusively with the street events, so that is a daily raffle, but
Hmm.
it is assigned spots. You just get them that day. Um, and I was doing the like a half circle show. There's two tiers for street. There's the circle shows, the big, large apparatus, large crowd performances, and then there's buskers, which would be musicians and smaller acts. Um, yeah, so I did that for 6 years.
That's something I'd love to talk about is like how do you work with like developing a set that works with a full circle crowd? Like with magic is so angle sensitive, that's something that for me, like when I practice close up magic, I very much have a weak spot. Like my left slash back side, like this is my weak spot. If somebody's standing there, they're gonna see what happens,
Yeah.
for like 80% of the stuff I do, you know. How did you work around that when you're doing these big shows?
I would choose effects that had as best angle proofness as you could. That like there's a reason you don't see huge shows with close-up magic.
Yeah.
Like there are limitations built into it, both angles and like vision-wise. Like in close-up, a card is pretty much the biggest thing you're going to use most of the time, and a card from 75 feet away is like it doesn't translate very well. So for me, I do think that I did better than most people as far as scaling a crowd size with a mostly close-up magic show. At different times, I would use my shoe as one of my biggest props. I would do a shoe production, and I'd have sizable feet, so that makes it for a decent prop. And it was part of a coin trick, so it immediately like would play bigger. But yeah, that's part of also why I was starting to branch a little more beyond magic into more physical arts and manipulation stuff.
Yeah. One of your like signature tricks, your most well known thing is the Frodo, where you toss your ring up and you catch it on your finger. How long did that take you to be able to do that?
That was about a year and a half before I did it in like on purpose in front of anybody.
Yeah.
I messed around with it for about a year and a half. I think it started on a fishing trip. I had like 4 days out in the middle of nowhere with my family, and on the first day, just kind of walking to and from something, I started doing it, and I thought you know, if I did this for like 45 minutes the next 4 days in a row, I bet that I could like get to a point where I could do it 1 out of 20 times.
Yeah.
And yeah, but a year and a half later, I started putting it in as something I would do before I actually started a show, just to get people curious. And then eventually it ended up becoming my finale. And to this day, like other than a breakdancer doing a flip over people with their body as the prop, like other than a person doing acrobatics, I'm pretty sure it's the biggest play of the smallest object in any street performance show in the world. I'm pretty sure that.
And I don't think anyone else in the world does that trick.
Yeah, I have never seen anybody
There's
else
probably
do it.
some kid who, you know,
There are people
is
that
trying
have
out
it,
there.
but
There's
not have
some
done it.
10-year-old kid out there who's going to be a master at it in like 5 years.
Yeah,
But so far, it's like your thing.
whether or not they'll put it in a show.
Yeah.
Like there's lots of things people practice at home, but I did this in front of people for like 5 or 6 years. So like that's one of the ways that I can sometimes frame my experience in a way that makes me like perplexed at my path, is that there was 5 years of my life where in order to get paid I had to throw a ring 30 feet in the air and catch it on my finger, and I didn't get paid unless I did that.
So what was it like then, you know, when you messed up a trick? Like anyone who practiced magic knows that that's a big part of it.
Totally.
Not getting it right. It seems like the pressure's on a lot harder when that's like your job and your income. You know?
Yeah, when it's live, there's no do-overs. You end up messing up in almost every way. It reaches the point, if you're a full-time worker and are doing shows consistently for a prolonged period of time, it reaches a point where if you mess something up in a way you haven't messed it up before, you are like excited that you have done something new, because most of the time you have messed something up in almost every way you can, and really through trial and error. Like sometimes you can pre-write and come up with something before it happens, but for me most of the time it was like I would mess something up in a embarrassing fashion and would then in an instant have to try to like recover, try to make it look like I didn't mess up, try and make it look like I did it on purpose, or have a joke for that, or try to connect with people by admitting that that was a mess up, like in a tongue-in-cheek kind of way. You learn to roll out of falls quite a bit as a street performer, because you can get 5-6 times trying every day in front of a live audience. Whereas if I was a booked matinee performer, I would get 2 max.
So let's talk a little bit, I guess, then about how COVID threw everything off course. Because like when you decide to learn to do street magic, it's one of those things that's like, okay, I can always fall back on this. No matter what happens, you know, I have this skill now that can be applied anywhere. And then COVID was like the ultimate wrench in that plan, where it's like, oh, now people don't want to stop and see other people. People are like afraid to be close to somebody. Like everything that makes street performing possible suddenly got like thrown the other direction. What was that like?
Yeah, I think myself and most other professional street performers, street is pretty hardy as far as a way of sustaining oneself. But COVID, I mean, we all had suits of armor on, and COVID was the arrow through the slit in the visor, because it's one of the few things that could make it to where we couldn't make our way. And so I had performed Saturday the 13th or 14th or whatever it was, mid-March, and then the next day I could just tell that the crowds weren't even going to be worth it. It was a Sunday, which I would normally work, but that was kind of when the news was coming in, and I immediately went into like stockpile and buy a weapon and all the basic impending apocalypse protections. So it was novel it was a novel time to be in New Orleans because it pretty much went from being a pop-in place to a complete ghost town. Like in actual where Bourbon Street is, like not a lot of people live there. Some people do, but not a lot of people live there. So being in New Orleans during that time, I was there from March until July, beginning of July. But really, as soon as COVID became politicized, as soon as I saw a division along lines that had already existed, that was when I acknowledged that it was going to be at least a year and that I should make the most of that time in between then because I knew that I wasn't going to go back to street anytime soon.
Before you had that realization, was there a period of time like that whole time was so confusing? Nobody knew what was going to happen and what next week was going to look like. And is this real or is this just another media blowing something out of proportion? Like nobody knew. Was there a period of time when you were still trying to make it work and you were realizing like no, things are actually going to be different?
It was pretty. It was pretty sharp.
You saw the writing on the
for
wall.
me. Yeah, I mean, it's messed up to think about, but like that's first again. To me, it really feels like it hit in over a weekend, like around the 13th, 14th, 15th, and like it was enough to be in the public conversation at that point. So every now and then someone would, you shake the hand of a volunteer and someone would heckle, someone would yell, COVID! Like it had started to be on the peripheral of people's consciousness. But, I was playing like Disturbed, Get Down with the Sickness as like my pre-show music, just like totally making light of it. And then the next day people were real weird, and then that was when I started looking into it more, and then I pretty much stopped then. That Sunday I didn't go out and immediately went into full prep mode.
So what did that look like for you? I mean, if your entire career at that point is pretty much based off this ability to interact with people, like how did you even begin to approach that pivot? I know it's something you'd kind of been thinking about anyways, but this obviously like made it something you had to figure out now. There's a difference between maybe I'll do this in a couple of years versus I have to do this now. So how do you make that pivot?
Getting into street in the first place, I think that doing it gradual was a big part of why I was able to do it. And that was my plan into photography and more or less online content creation. I was aiming for like a e-commerce to be selling prints and such online. So I had some groundwork established there, but in that first month or two, it wasn't clear that I was going to be dropping everything. So I wasn't like immediately trying to get a photography business going then. There's just so much uncertainty in those first few months that it really wasn't until I decided to leave New Orleans in July-ish that I began to think like, okay, I'm gonna go to Washington now, so I am actually gonna like need to have another line of work set up. I was able to make it that far because March was kind of the peak season in New Orleans, so I had half of a month of peak work. So I had some savings going into the pandemic, but it has still been hard to figure it out. I mean, I now am getting more work as a photographer and videographer, but it's not anywhere near where I was when I was working street. I'm still not back to my level of income and like stability in my life that I was then. And taking step backs in your 20s like that is hard, but doable. But taking a step back like that at 32 was very challenging. And it had very much undone a lot of the confidence that had been built becoming an established performance artist. So I put almost 10 years into that. And then in a like 6-month period, decided I needed to have a whole different, unrelated career established. So
big change to make.
Yeah, it's been hard.
Yeah. Have you been in touch with any other people within the like street theater community about how they've made the transition?
Yeah, I have talked to some of them. You're referring to the transition out of street.
Yeah, or just dealing with COVID in general, whether they got out of it or tried to make it work.
Yeah, a few guys in New Orleans did try and stick it out, but I could just see where, for me, the time for me to be able to do that was earlier in my life, to be able to handle that much difficulty. Like, street is already a super challenging thing, but doing it when the rest of the conditions are not favorable, it's just like really hard. You're pushing something big uphill. Um, and I just didn't want to try and contend with that. But people that have pivoted out of street and successfully started some other career, that's the thing that I've talked to them about going into it, like before the pandemic. And a lot of them, said the gradual thing helped a lot.
Yeah.
So it didn't help me, but I, make the most of it.
Have you had any trouble or experience yet, like in trying to make this pivot and get other work, where like the experience that you've had has come up, where like you've, I don't know, applied for a video job and they're like, what were you doing for the past 8 years? And you're like street performing. And I mean, I know that I think that's a really cool thing to do with your time, but I know that there can be a certain stigma around it within certain circles. Have you experienced that at all?
There is just in general not a very solid understanding in the public sphere about what entails professional street performing. Um, it depends really on what people have encountered in their life, and there's
Yeah.
a lot of variance and quality there. For me, I did mostly pivot into camera work, but I also got a real estate broker's license as something to try and learn on the side. And in that regard, I have had some difficulty coming to terms with like how to integrate these things. At first, it was very much something that I wanted to not have, like just totally separate world. Um, and now, the longer I'm into it, the more I think that I'm gonna need to blend them and integrate them if I'm gonna be able to do work in that field in an authentic way. Uh, but the skill carryover is something that I think I still haven't really seen the potential of. Like, I feel like I have been out of social scenarios for so long that my ability to connect with people in like big groups and make impressions is something that is covered in dust right now. But, I would love to mix the two, like in the most extreme way possible. I would love to be doing shows for people that I'm also pitching photography gigs and real estate too.
Yeah. And now that like the most extreme parts of COVID are behind us, knock on wood, like
It's so weird, man.
now that things are starting to gain some sort of sense of normalcy again with the vaccine and whatnot, have you given thought to going back to street? Do you think it's something that is like bouncing back, the street like art form in general, or do you think it's still something that's struggling because of everything that's gone on?
I think that it is bouncing back, and I think that there is very much potential for there to be an upswing when people do return to feeling comfortable in being in crowds and have been starved of live entertainment for a long time and will be then very appreciative. I think that that exists as a potential. I don't think that we're there yet. I think that there's still a good bit of fear and concern. It has been very challenging for me personally because there are places in the world where people are back to doing shows and it is like good times. That's hard to see when you've set it down for the reasons that were outside of your control, more or less. But I didn't really start missing it until pretty recently. But But part of the plan of coming back to Washington and getting into new careers was I would love to have street be like a third of my life. I would love to have it be like a portion of what I do with my time and a portion of what I am generating as far as income. It's just a lot to do full time. It's a lot to stand in front of 100 people 4 times a day, 4 days a week for the year. Like, I just found myself becoming shaped by the energy in a way that seemed like it wouldn't be conducive to my growth as a person in the long term.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a give and a take there, because on some level you're right, like the enormous amount of energy that it takes to do that. But I think also the fact that you were making yourself do that for so long probably instilled like a lot of self motivation that is going to help you in whatever direction you go in. Like so many people, including myself, struggle when you don't have someone else holding you accountable, but you have to hold yourself accountable. Like that's such a difficult thing, and to make street work, you have to do that.
Absolutely.
So that's definitely something that transfers. What if you were to meet yourself right before you started on the road, like right before the 3-month experiment began, or somebody like you, somebody who's thinking about doing something like that, what advice would you bestow to them?
To myself, I was doing it for the story. That was very much a clear intention from the beginning. It was like, I want to have this be a thing that I can carry with me the rest of my life. And so that was very much, I blogged a good bit while I was doing this, and that was while I was getting into street and travel, and very much trying to like share the experience of what was going on, share the story. So if I were to meet myself in 2012, I would say like buy good cameras, but take out even more. Like there were some parts of the trip, these travels that I did on credit cards and such, and most of that was just getting started, getting motorcycle gear, like buying helmet and shit. Like I didn't have any money for any of that. I would advise myself to get another credit card and get some good camera stuff, because I did all of it on GoPros, and there's just so much that doesn't translate with that. And I'd say talk to the camera more, because that was one thing I didn't do. So I just showed what was going on, and I didn't communicate what the experience was. So to somebody else, if that is an angle that they were going for, was to like be sharing the experience, then I would say make sure that you have the right tools to do so, like set up a framework.
Yeah. Well, it's pretty cool, man.
Hell of a lot of fun. I'm really glad I did it. I am aware of the trade-off there. A lot of my friends own houses and have kids now, and part of getting into different careers is to open up the possibilities for different avenues ahead of me. But I wouldn't do it any other way. I wouldn't have done it differently if I could. In 99 out of 100 rooms, I have one of the more interesting stories as far as what I did with my 20s. So that's worth it for me. For a lot of my youth, if I felt as though I could die happy for a lot of it. Like pretty much 8 years straight, I was on the edge of what I was capable of.
So now that you're in this different period, is there a current goal as to like how to bring this stuff together, how to maybe with more balance kind of achieve that same feeling, but like with a more balanced place? Is that kind of where you're trying to head right now?
I had gotten an apartment in New Orleans and signed an 18-month lease in, 2018. So this was the beginning of the beginning of the end of the travel chapter, at least the extensive, like, I'm going to go travel for 5 months straight
Yeah.
pattern that I had been living in. And the idea there was to, like, get good at some things that I wanted to then be able to take with me on the road going forward. And I had about a year and a half, not quite a year and a half of time in that space to do that. Um, but there's like a lot of different things that I was trying to learn and still trying to learn. So right now I'm taking advantage of the situation I'm in as far as housing and my just general life setup to kind of continue that while also still trying to get the rest of my, I guess, most of my finances and my work options better established. Street's great in the freedom it offers you, but you then still got to go out and do shows. And I just would like to reach a point where I could be street performing, but if there's a event or something that I want to go to on a Saturday afternoon, I don't feel bad about not going and performing.
Yeah.
So there's a definitely trade off when like your work involves the fun time hours and Fridays or your Mondays, you know.
Yeah. That's a hard thing in general when you are trying to do the thing you love for a living, trying to also keep that work life balance. It's very difficult.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, you definitely went to an extreme of it because when you're on the road and you're doing full-time street performing, I mean, there's very little separation, it seems like, between those. It's probably kind of nice to be able to find some sort of way to balance it, even if you're still figuring it out.
It will be nice.
Yeah.
It will be nice. Right now, I'm still at the part where I'm disconnected from it. I've begun to get the little tendrils of it kind of peeking back into my thoughts. But yeah, it will be nice to have more options moving forward. It very much was all encompassing. It very much was a whole lifestyle based occupation. And it'll be nice to have a little more balance.
Was there like if you just look back at the whole street life, in general, was there like a big takeaway that you got from this life experience? Was there some insight that you gained from going on this crazy 8-year adventure?
Uh, yeah, I'll probably borrow some words, some phrasing from a lot of different people. The risk of making a statement like that, like the risk of sending it on whatever the dream or thing or goal, like the desired outcome can sometimes seem so grand or distant that the idea of even pursuing it is foolish, seems foolish. Um, but the danger of not doing it is so drastically underestimated, and the like slow death by 1,000 needles, 1,000 paper cuts, pain and discomfort from always wondering about what it would have been like. Um, it's almost always better to fail spectacularly in the direction that you intended than to like
Play it safe
have
and fail anyway.
yeah, have like silent suffering success. Like,
Yeah.
yeah, that's one of the main things.
Yeah, I mean that's definitely one of the things that I really admired about you and your choice to go through with that, is just you took control of your life. You really said like I am going to live the way I want to. I'm going to do the things I care about and society be damned kind of. And like that takes a lot of balls and a lot of sacrifice, but I think that you really proved that like it can be done, and also like facing those challenges only makes you stronger in the end.
Yeah, street definitely was a like really big blessing as far as being a vehicle that allowed me to do that, allowed me to pursue my interest in travel and having autonomy over my schedule. Um, it is a very special thing. There's more and more freelance opportunities, more and more like potential paths someone can take that provide them with their own control in their life. But at least for me, I feel like aren't told about them very much. We're not very well educated on how to take control of our own lives. Um, Whatever the reasons for that may be, we could speculate, but uh, I very much was aware at the time that like I was literally controlling everything about how my life would be. It's dangerous to ride motorcycles across the country, but um, I would trust my hands first in that scenario. That was basically what I wanted to get good at. I wanted to get like become confident in trusting my own ability to take care of myself, keep myself out of danger, get what I am striving for. And I learned how to do that quite a bit.
I think it's really interesting to look at kind of just the transition you've been going through. And like, it's one of those things that we know is happening to so many people right now. And like in the past year, like artists in general got hit so hard by the pandemic, but especially the street performers who like don't necessarily focus on like their social media and their online presence to like bring in income, even if they have those stuff to like build a following. A lot of the time that's it's not really where their focus is. And so it's just like I feel like this highly underrepresented like demographic, you know, are the street performers who got affected. And just by the nature of where their stage is, a lot of those stories aren't being told. But I appreciate getting the chance to hear your side of it at least.
Yeah. Um, Street in general is the thing that I have thought I could see myself being involved with beyond performing, be it in like education or city planning. Like, there's plenty of research out there that shows the benefits of having street performers in a public space. They're pretty um, pretty solidified as like a sign of a healthy public area. If people can be entertained there, then the economics and the crime and the rate of people passing through and all that, like, it's generally a good health sign. Um, and I'd love to help facilitate that in some way in the future, even if it's just talking to cities about how they can better integrate the possibility of street.
This has been an awesome conversation. And
Yeah.
I'm glad that you were willing to come and talk to me about it.
Yeah.
And we can do it again.
Totally.
You know, I think this was a good like icebreaker, like get the main storyline out of the way.
Yeah.
And then the next times you come over, we can just shoot the shit about whatever's on our mind.
Yeah.
Get a little less structured about it.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you guys so much for watching all the way to the end. This was my first long form interview that I've done for this channel. I had a great time talking to Niko. I hope you had a good time listening to it. I realized that this episode was a little rough around the edges, but I'm new to this. This was my first episode. I recorded it weeks before I even picked out a name for this channel. So cut me a little bit of slack. It's going to keep getting better and better. I have some great guests lined up for you. So hit the subscribe button, tune in for the next one, and we'll just keep doing it. Thank you guys.